Do you struggle sewing set-in sleeves? And no matter how many times you try or how careful you are with gathering, you still might have some puckers along that shoulder seam? Yeah, I get it. And no matter how many times I sew sleeves and how hard I try, they're not always perfect. Today, I'm going to be sharing a different way to sew in sleeves that works for almost every pattern. And with this one extra step, you can ensure that your sleeves go in smoothly and look great. So stay tuned. Hi, I'm Tony, and this is So Lounge. Now, today we're going to be working with McCall's 8160. This is my favorite dress. I have made it on two other occasions back in July and November of 2023, and it is a fast and easy dress to make and it looks great. Now, the reason I chose this pattern is because the instructions are for sewing a flat sleeve, and I believe this is the first pattern I ever came across that actually recommended this method for sleeve insertion. So while I've heard of sewing sleeves in flat, I had never actually come across it in pattern instructions. That's why we're using this pattern today. Now, I have heard that flat sleeve construction can be used on any type of sleeve, even when the instructions say to use the traditional set-in sleeve method. I don't know if it will work as well because the reason this works so well for this pattern is because it has a very shallow sleeve cap. So you can see that the line of the armhole sleeve, it doesn't have the big bump in it that you need to really gather to get it into that space of the armhole seam. It's pretty shallow. So getting it all lined up and fitting it in works a lot easier than if you had more volume that needed to go around your shoulder as part of the design of the sleeve. So just keep that in mind. But if you're someone who uses the flat method all the time, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Now, when you look at these instructions, they are pretty easy to follow. We're on step number 8, under sleeve and underarm seam, if you're following along. Now, with the right sides together, I'm going to match up my sleeve with the armhole edge. I'm going to match the notches, the small dots, and the large dot with the shoulder seam, get it all lined up, baste it in place, stitch twice, trim, and then we'll move on to finishing the underarm seam. So here's the thing. I have found, since I've made this more than once, that adding one extra step really makes a difference. Now, you don't have to do this, but if you want to make sure it sews in right the first time, adding a row of basting stitches to this outside edge of the sleeve along the sleeve cap will make a huge difference. How do I know this? Because I didn't do it the first time I made this dress and I ended up taking out the sleeves and redoing it and adding the basting stitch. And you can just ease it into that armhole seam without any problems. It makes a neater finish and it works every time. So let's head over to the sewing machine. I'm going to show you how to do this. All right, so as an aside, because always look ahead, if depending on how you want to finish the bottom of your sleeve, you may want to serge that bottom edge before we go put any of the sleeve in. Technically, you could do this after you put in the sleeve, but before you sew that side seam, but just kind of keep that in mind. I'm just going to turn this up once we do all the final steps. So I have my machine set to a basting stitch and I have all of my thread in there and the proper needle for this type of fabric. I'm just going to um, line up the edge of my presser foot with the outside edge of this sleeve cap, and I'm going to be basting at 1/4 of an inch just to help get the sleeve in there just a little bit easier, and you'll see what I mean in a second. Okay, so basting stitches in. Now I'm going to go back to the instructions and get my sleeve pinned in the armhole seam and get everything all lined up. This is where the challenge happens because this fabric print it's hard to figure out which side is which, and I decided to use tailor tacks to mark everything so I could see it. And this is the front there. So I know that my tailor tacks with the little fuzzy parts, that's the right side of the fabric. So I need to line these up. That does not go on that one. Right sides together. So I'm going to start by matching my notches. And then I'm going to move on to matching the uh, large dot at the shoulder seam, and then I will move the um, make sure the smaller dots get lined up next. All right, so I'm getting this all pinned together. I have my notches pinned here and here. And one thing I forgot to mention is that when you're doing the basting, you want to sew it between the notches. Um, with a set-in sleeve, you usually put in 2 rows of basting. However, with this kind of sleeve, 1 row is sufficient. I'm just gonna go match this edge over here. So we have the basic notches in place, the sleeve edge in place with that underarm seam, and I have my center mark. Now, next step is going to be to match the small dots. Let's see, I made tailor's tacks in this blue thread because nothing was showing up on this fabric. So you want to match them. I'm just gonna put the 2 of them together. I know they're in the same space because I made tailor tacks and that ensures they're in the exact same spot on both sides. But now you can see that there's a little bit of gathering that needs to be done to get this to all line up. So I had stretched out my basting a little bit or gathered it a little bit to just kind of help make that curve happen. So it's just very, very minor. You can see there's a little bit of fluting on the sleeve edge. See there? But this is just going to help it get in there a little bit better than if you didn't use it. I added a few extra pins to make sure that everything stays in place. I'm going to be basting at 3/8 of an inch because later I'm going to baste first at 3/8, then I'm going to sew the seam at 5/8, and then I need to go back in and they want me to sew an extra stitch line at 1/4 of an inch and then trim to that line. Now, what I'm going to do instead though is serge my sleeve together to finish that raw edge. And so I'm not going to do that last 1/4 inch stitch line. But if you want to do it, put the basting in between the 2 lines. It'll make things a little bit easier. I'm just removing each of my pins as I get to it. Even though I'm basting, I do not want a pin jamming up my machine. The basting stitches are all in. Everything looks lined up. And I am going to go back in with my 5/8 inch at the regular stitch line. Okay, when I flip this over, I realized that my line got a little off at the seam allowance because I moved it to try and not catch it on the back. Um, I guess this is the reason we do basting stitches. I also put on my reading glasses so I could see this a little better, and that's when I realized the problem. So I'm just gonna pull that out real quick and then just reline everything up in the right spot and not worry about rebasting it because, it's just basting stitches. So, and I can just get it back where it needs to be pretty easily without having to go through that whole process again. Yeah, it just slipped a tiny bit. So nothing too major, but just wanted to share that this did not go in perfectly. Hopefully the next one will. So let me switch my machine back over to my usual stitch length. And I think I'm going to raise my table. This is flat, so it's not as complicated, but I think it's just easier to have my fabric like kind of lifted away from the rest of my garment when I'm trying to sew the seam. It's just going to be a little bit easier to have everything out this way. I'm going to go put in the other one and then we'll do the serging to finish that edge and then move on to the next step. So you can see this is the first step in putting in the sleeve. Now I did go ahead and finish it with my serger and it is pressed towards the outside of the sleeve away from the shoulder seam. But if you look a little closer, you can see that it's nice and smooth on the inside. The sleeve went in very evenly. It matched up on both edges. and it looks really great. Now, if we flip it over to the outside, this is where people tend to have problems. This is the shoulder seam here. And then you can see that there are no puckers or anything along that top of the sleeve cap where there can sometimes be problems. You can see the seam in there. And it's nice and smooth, and it went in without any difficulty. Now, the next step is going to be pinning the sleeve together and then going all the way down the side seam. One tip, if you are going to be making this dress, I find it's a lot easier to finish the sleeve if you pre-press in the seam allowance before you sew this underarm seam. It just makes it a lot easier than trying to press this once it's already round. It's much easier to press into place and do, however much of a seam allowance you want. I think it's 1.25 inches on the pattern. I do mine at about 1 inch because that's where I like it to hit. And then once you pin it all together, I just unfold it from where I pressed it. And then that way, when it's all done, I'll just flip it all back into place. And then it's much quicker to just get that finished. But you can see that everything is lining up the way it's supposed to. Make sure that when you start to stitch this underarm seam, the armhole seam is going towards the sleeve on both sides. Pin those going out. And then I'm just going to continue to match the notch under, there should be another one, yeah, the side seam notch. Get that all matched up. There we go. And then sew in this final seam, and then the sleeve's going to be done. So it's fast, and then all of a sudden, there's minimal finishing done on the dress, and I will show you how the end result looks. Let me just get this all pinned real quick. I'm going to just go back up to the top part of the sleeve and get this outside edge all pinned. Okay, so that is it. It's all pinned into place. I'm going to get this stitched at 5/8 of an inch and then finishing the sleeve. All right, I just finished the hem. I'm going to give my dress a quick press and then put it on the dress form and show you how that sleeve turned out. So you can see this is the shoulder seam coming down the side. No puckers. It all looks really good. It is a little hard to see in this print, I will give you that, but you can see that it's a really nice smooth line. It looks good. The shoulder seam, there's no puckers up there. All nice and smooth. The gathering helped get it in perfectly. And, that's the whole point of doing this type of sleeve, is to make things a little bit easier. I'm really happy with the way my dress turned out. These are just little kind of slightly dropped sleeves. It looks really good. Now, one thing worth mentioning is the fact that if you don't have a pattern that specifically tells you to use this method and you choose to use a flat sleeve insertion technique instead of the round sleeve insertion technique, just be aware that you may have what is called seam dominance. So what that means is, because you're sewing the sleeve out of order, meaning that you're not sewing the shoulder seam first and then the side seam and then putting the sleeve into those two seams, you might have a fit difference than you would if you followed the instructions. So what I mean by that is, let me show you. If you have this kind of a sleeve and you raise your arm, this whole seam is going to move along with the rest of the sleeve. Whereas if you had a set-in sleeve, the sleeve would move by itself, but this side seam would not. So thanks to Beth Ann for sending me an article about that. I did not know it had a name, and so I appreciate that extra tip to be able to share it with you today. This dress will probably not have that issue because this was the technique used in the pattern instructions to sew it. So I'm guessing that it's accommodating for this design specifically. I have not noticed that to be a problem when I raise my arm to notice that the side seam rides up at all. I think there's enough ease in this dress that it's not noticeable or it's just not a problem. Now, if you're interested in learning how to sew a correct set-in sleeve, I made a video with Grandma a couple of years ago. She takes me through it step by step and I demonstrate so you too can learn how to make the perfect sleeve. It's the video coming up next. You totally want to check it out. It will change your sleeve sewing game, and I'll see you over there.